Good evening, everybody. My name is Stephen Woolfolk. I'm the Director of Programming for the Kansas City Public Library. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you also to everyone who is watching at home. I want to start off with an apology. We had books ordered tonight, but due to the regional storms that came through, that delivery has been delayed. So I do still encourage you to read the book. You can order it from an independent bookstore here at bookshop.org, or the QR code will take you directly to the page for this book. The library also has additional copies on order, so feel free to check it out from us as well. Any way you read the book, we would love to see you do it. Before we get started, I want to mention one program that is coming up next week. We're very excited for the return of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College and their nationally renowned Department of History as they launch a new series on the rise and fall of empires. Maybe timely, we'll see. The discussion next Wednesday, right back here in Hillsburg Auditorium, will center on the 1815 Battle of New Orleans and historian Harry Laver's contention that it set America on the path to becoming a global superpower and foreshadowed the decline of Britain's worldwide empire. We hope to see you back here for that, but first we have a great program for you tonight. Kevin Schultz is an award-winning historian and professor with special interests in American intellectual and cultural life, writing for both academic and popular audiences. His previous book, Buckley and Mailer, The Difficult Friendship That Shaped the 60s, was an Amazon #1 new release in history. He previously visited the library nearly 10 years ago on July of 2015 for a discussion of that book, and we couldn't be happier to have him back here tonight to share with us his latest book, Why Everyone Hates White Liberals, Including White Liberals. Such a tantalizing title. I'm reluctant to share too many of my thoughts on the book because I don't want to spoil anything, so I will just say this. I identify as a liberal. I have many liberal friends. I have many liberal acquaintances, but I am under no illusion that I could define liberalism in a way that everyone in this room would agree with me. I have friends who identify as social liberals and believe the government has an obligation to ensure that citizens are healthy, educated, and guaranteed a minimum standard of living. I have friends who identify as classical liberals and most closely identify with modern-day libertarianisms. I sometimes identify as a neoliberal, but I suspect my beliefs would be best categorized as ordoliberalism, or the belief that a free market is necessary, but strong government oversight is also necessary, and to ensure that the economy is fair and operates as close as possible to its theoretical potential. And that's just a few of the flavors of American liberalism. We are a big tent. And sometimes a big tent breeds distrust of your fellow tent mates. And it gives people outside the tent license to cherry pick qualities in order to create a caricature, not with the intent of understanding, but with the intent of criticizing. Kevin Schultz has spent years studying those various forms of liberalism and has examined the ways that they interact with one another, and he understands how they are viewed nationally and globally by people on the left and the right. He's uniquely qualified to help us understand exactly why it is everyone hates white liberals. Please welcome back to the Kansas City Public Library, Kevin Schultz.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you so much. Now I feel like I don't have to give my talk because Steve already explained all the varieties of liberals. Thank you all for coming out today. And I want to say coming to the Kansas City Public Library is kind of a magical experience. The programming that they have here and the people who come out to that programming is just fantastic. Last time I was here, I had great questions, great interaction. It was just a marvelous experience. It was so good, I came back to do it again. So thank you for sort of doing civic duty and creating a society when we really need to find community and commonalities. So thank you to you for providing that. And also thank you, of course, to the Kansas City Public Library and to Steve Woolfolk, who is doing such a good job, and Sophie Williams and Anna Bernard, who did such a good job publicizing it and making sure that you all show up. And for some of the people who maybe we're not quite old timers yet, but I did want to acknowledge the person I first met when I came to Kansas City Public Library, who is Henry Fortunato, who was sort of a fantastic guy in my experience. Maybe you have different stories, but my experience was he's a fantastic guy, and it's a loss that he's no longer with us. So I just wanted to acknowledge that today. Okay, for my talk today, it's a topic that is deadly serious, by which I mean the threat to the survival of democracy in the United States of America, and why the polar extremes of our politics seem to dominate so much of the discourse, and why the center, and what I call the center left in the United States, has really failed to mount any sort of viable opposition to the current Republican administration. Deadly serious stuff. But before I get to that, and because I'm an affable guy and want us all to have a good time tonight, and also because of the way in which my subject, white liberals, have been treated historically, I'd like to start a little bit lighter. So we'll get to the dark stuff in a little bit, I promise. And I hope to end in something of an inspirational tone, because right now I find myself hopeful, if not quite optimistic, if we can say that. But let's start in dreamland first. Let's start where anything is possible. Let's start where discourse is civil and people are thoughtful. Let's start in Hollywood, of course, right? Do y'all remember The West Wing? Actually, I should say before you answer that, one of the very nice things about writing about white liberals is that they occupy a certain demographic that understand my historical references. So, of course you remember The West Wing. For the staffers here doing the social media part of it, what The West Wing was... My jokes are working today. What The West Wing was a brilliant, if sometimes terribly hokey television show from the late 1990s and early 2000s, created by Aaron Sorkin to fulfill his wildest liberal dreams. At the show's inception, Sorkin figured The West Wing would demonstrate what Bill Clinton could do better. But then when George W. Bush became president in 2001, the show turned into an alternate universe for liberals in hiding. What if Bush v. Gore had been decided differently? We could tune in every week, back when you had to tune in every week, and find out. The fantasy lasted 2 presidential terms. But Sorkin's fictional president, a guy named Jedediah Bartlett, I'm bringing you all down memory lane a little bit here, who happened to have a Nobel Prize in economics and also have Bible-ready Catholicism ready to slay a born-again that might come and try and challenge his Christian faith. Martin Sheen, of course. When his second term came to end in 2005, the 2 aspirants to replace him held a debate. And the episode was actually something, I remember watching it, it was actually something of a milestone in television history because it was televised live. Once on the East Coast for East Coast audience, and one on the West Coast for West Coast audience. And I do not know where us Midwesterners in Chicago and Kansas City, actually which one we got to see. But the debate, if you'll remember, if you happen to be watching back then in 2005, it went the way that most of us wish presidential debates went. It was a wide open affair operating at high caliber with deep discussions about important issues. Lawrence O'Donnell, who was the head writer at the time, he called it my wish fulfillment debate. And what was his wish? It was a return to fighting liberalism. In perhaps the most memorable exchange, and one you can still find on YouTube today, the Republican candidate, played by Alan Alda, chided the Democrat, played by Jimmy Smits, for being, and I quote, an unthinking liberal who foolishly assumes the evil capitalists are screwing the workers. But the Democrat Smits fired back. I know you like to use that word liberal as if it were a crime. Then Smits pushed back with aggression, force, and gasp, historical insight. He said, what did liberals do that was so offensive to the Republican Party? I'll tell you what they did. Liberals got women the right to vote. Liberals got African Americans the right to vote. Liberals created Social Security and lifted millions of elderly people out of poverty. Liberals ended segregation. Liberals passed the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. Liberals created Medicare. Liberals passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. What did conservatives do? They opposed them on every one of those things. Every single one. So when you try and hurl that label at my feet, liberal, as if it were something to be ashamed of, something dirty, something to run away from, it won't work, Senator, because I will pick up that label and I will wear it as a badge of honor. Well, yeah, right? And that's what I did on my couch watching that. Whoa, yay. I was a young budding historian at the time, before being jaded by the halls of the ivory tower in my underfunded public university where I teach, thinking, hell yeah, history is important. And then I also remember thinking, what the hell is he talking about right now? What is going on? Because in the real world, liberals were being portrayed as something completely different. And in fact, in 2007, shortly after the airing of that episode of The West Wing, the then Democratic presidential candidate, a woman by the name of Hillary Clinton, she would be beaten in the primary by a guy named Barack Obama, you might remember. She was asked in a gotcha moment by a member of the press if she was a liberal, and she brushed off the question. And she said, liberal was a word that was originally meant that you were for freedom, but it has been turned on its head and made to be a word that describes big government. She then added, completing her dissociation from the word, I'm not a liberal, I prefer the word progressive, a proud, modern American progressive. And if it wasn't bad enough that the Democrats were disowning their own liberal tradition, worse still was the stuff I was seeing on the early days of the internet, especially from the corners of the right-wing media sphere, whose sole mission at the time, then, and continuing on to today, is to own the libs, to make the libs cry, to call their enemies, and these are their words, not mine, I just want to say that out loud, libtards. You might remember that. If you don't know what that is, I invite you to look it up on Urban Dictionary. And one of the perils of writing this book, mind you, is that I had to spend a good amount of time in the right-wing media sphere looking up the etymology of words like libtard. I took a shower, and so... But to say the least, this animosity towards liberals has continued to this very day. To bring us up to the very recent past, in the 2024 election, President Donald Trump labeled Kamala Harris a dangerous liberal many times. I would screenshot them, say, my book is relevant, my book is relevant. I was writing it then, I needed reminders. And Donald Trump was hoping that the neural pathways of the American electorate would be triggered into being scared of her, because liberals were scary in the American imagination. And anyway, the only unifying philosophy that I could find on the American right for the past 2 decades has not been libertarian small government politics, on the one hand, or a return to something called family values or Christian values, on the other hand. Instead, it has been to trigger the libs. I have lots and lots of quotations that I can cite that you'll find in the book. But anecdotally speaking, from something I just saw recently, a personal favorite, I was driving to my mother and father-in-law's house in Florida over spring break, and I encountered at one of these truck stops a wall of t-shirts. Maybe you've seen them at some of the places, and the wall of t-shirts were various, mostly right-wing paraphernalia. There were some that were less so. But one that I took a picture of read, "I oil my gun with liberal tears." Which I'm not sure if liberals, if we cry with oil, I'm not entirely sure how that shirt works, but it made me laugh. Now, of course, this wasn't always the case. In fact, my frustration at this current moment in American politics, where there seems to be a huge amount of political polarization, and yet there's a lot of common things that most Americans believe in. And if you don't believe me, I'll talk a little bit about it, but we can talk about it too. There is this general bell curve of belief in the American population that Gallup and all the pollsters are telling us on things as hot button issues as abortion or gun safety rights. It's a bell curve where you get extremes on either end. Most Americans are in the middle of the bell, right? And there's nobody who seems to be representing or speaking for that central position. So my frustration at this tension, where has the middle of American politics gone? Why are the extremes so amplified in our times? This ran into my historical research. So my previous books have been about mid-20th century American liberalism in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. and its development, where it came from, its expansion, how it was trying to work at times to include impoverished Americans, how it was working at times to include women, how it was working at times to include Black Americans, Latinos. Liberal had been the central and centrist tradition for much of the decades of the middle of the 20th century. In 1949, for instance, when the word liberal was on everybody's lips, it was to signify a central spot between Hitler's Nazi authoritarianism on the right and Stalin's Soviet communism on the left. And what was in the middle? Something called liberalism. The great historian and soon-to-be JFK advisor Arthur Schlesinger Jr. called it the vital center. He's trying to claim this central position. People, of course, were poking fun at it even then. I found a quotation from 1949 that said, "A liberal is a man who is constantly and simultaneously being kicked in the teeth by the commies and in the pants by the National Association of Manufacturers." But still, despite the jibe, there was the general sense that liberals were good people, and they were upholding core central values that were important in American life. One reporter in 1949, the story where this line came from, said that of all the people he interviewed, and I'm quoting him here, just about everybody thought that a liberal was a pretty good thing to be. Well, that was 1949. If you fast forward today, you get someone like Don Bongino, who was basically Rush Limbaugh's heir. He actually filled Rush Limbaugh's spot in the media sphere after Rush Limbaugh died. And now, of course, he's been tapped by the current Republican administration to be the deputy director of the FBI. Back when he was a journalist, YouTuber, podcaster, radio personality, in 2021, he had a completely different understanding of how liberals should be judged. He said, and I'm quoting, "The liberals are the man. They run the big corporations." Prepare yourself for how well this quote doesn't age, but we'll see how it goes, okay? They run the big corporations. They run YouTube. They run Facebook. They run the government. It's actually kind of shocking to read this, considering all the people that were running these companies were hardly liberals when they were sitting at the front row of Donald Trump's recent inauguration, right? But because of the fact that these so-called liberals controlled media and big corporations, Don Bongino declared, "We are descending at an increasingly rapid rate into fascism, chaos. You're seeing the evaporation of civil liberties in live time, the Bill of Rights being used like toilet paper. And all of this is happening because of the liberals." Well, that got dark. So much for civility. And it seems the liberals are to blame. But as we come up for air, it's worth it to reflect that there's been a significant change in how liberals are perceived from 1949 to today. And that's the story I get to tell in my book. How did we come to a point where nearly everyone hates white liberals, including, as I say, and we all heard it in Steve's voice, I think, many white liberals? How has the hatred of liberals come to be the defining glue of so many sides of American politics? Not just the right, but even the left, which rails against liberals themselves. One of my good friends just wrote a book about Marx in America, and he identifies on the far left spectrum of politics, and he hates the liberals too. We'll get to why in a second. Where did all the liberals go, by the way? And when did that stop being a term people would openly grab onto and fight for? After all, liberals had fought the Great Depression and won World War II against authoritarians and fascists. They had helped secure civil rights for Black Americans and greater rights for women. They created things that people love, like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and even FEMA. And I'm reminded that your Senator Josh Hawley was just going to Kristen Noem begging for FEMA to come to the state of Missouri to help out with the last 2 weeks of actions because FEMA has been a no-show because so many people have been fired. Yet there's Josh Hawley saying, "Bring these things back, please." So that began my quest. Where had the liberals all gone? And at a deeper level, this is really what I was after. Where had the center of American politics gone? And who was defending it? And why did everyone seem to hate white liberals anyway? So I put on my glasses and my elbow-patched plaid coat, and I headed to the library. I'm just kidding. That's not how we dress when we go do research. We're not English professors. That joke works better when you're talking to academics, but here are 4 things that I learned when I was doing my research. First, this was a surprise to me. I was actually super excited to learn this. Liberal is something new in American political language. As a historian, I've always heard about the liberal tradition in American life. And a lot of the thinkers that people claim are liberals go back to the time of our founding, our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, or even John Locke or Rousseau. Not so. Of course, the word has a very rich history, but not in the United States. So liber is Latin for free. Those of you who went to Catholic school might remember from having to sit through Latin classes. In Shakespeare's time, liberal was widely used as a familiar synonym for personal generosity, both material and intellectual. So this word is changing over time, is the story I'm telling. To be a liberal in the 16th and 17th century was to be broad-minded and perhaps to have a liberal education. College students will remember taking liberal arts classes, which meant that your study was focused on a broad education rather than a narrow vocational one. So you learned philosophy, literature, theater, and not just what it was you were going to do. By the 18th century, the word got more baggage. Religious tolerance was added to what it meant to be liberal. People might possess different spiritual values and beliefs, but this was no justification for expulsion or worse. Slowly, a liberal was someone who was generally open to change and sometimes even welcoming it. Then the revolutions in France, the French Revolution, and the United States, the American Revolution, happened in the late 18th century, and they add to the word's meaning for the first time a belief in several individual rights. This one hits close to us today, probably. And most especially in our right to a representative government. That's what liberal meant then. In the 19th century, many Europeans marched under the banner of liberalism in order to advocate free markets. And this has now come to be called classical liberalism, even though there are many generations of liberalisms that predate it. But this is what people talk about when they say classical liberalism, is an embrace of the free market. Because in the 19th century, many people in Europe, especially, saw liberalism as a way to expand individual freedoms from being under the yoke of kings and queens and religious orders like the Catholic Church. So to enhance your freedom, to enhance your liberality, was to embrace the free market so you didn't have to pay homage to kings and queens and to popes. But then the industrialists grew to be the power holders in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the word liberal began to shift once again. Now it represents something akin to what we generally understand to be the preservation and protection of individual freedoms by using the power of the government to check oligarchic power and provide a social welfare floor to allow individual achievement, to allow you to do what you want to do. Now, my big find in doing all this research was that in 1932 in the United States, no one used the word this way. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt who gave it something close to this current meaning in the summer of 1932. I found it. This is like a research gold moment when you're like, this is it. This speech in 1932, he was testing out all these different phrases to come up with a way to label his New Deal, the package of programs that was designed to combat the Great Depression. And he knew that his New Deal would be tarred as socialism, which had radical meanings at the time. So he wanted a word that wasn't socialism. He wanted to name it before it got named. And in this one speech in the summer of 1939, he stumbled on the word liberalism. He redefined it to signify an economic arrangement premised on the government regulation of capitalism, not the destruction of capitalism, but the regulation of capitalism, and use of the state to provide safety and security for its citizens. That's how he called liberal. That's what liberalism meant to him. Then he masterfully pitted his liberalism against his opponents, who he blamed for bringing about the Great Depression, and he called his opponents conservatives. And ever since 1932, we in the United States have had the liberal versus conservative political divide. I was so excited when I found that. So the word doesn't go back deep into American history. The ideas that it comes to signify, they have a history, but the word liberal is relatively new. It's less than 100 years old in American usage. There are some American uses that go back further. They don't mean the same thing that we mean. A lot of it has to do with anti-Catholicism, which I can go into if you're super interested in that stuff. But it was not in common usage. It was in Europe. Los Liberales were the first party in Spain in 1810. In Britain, of course, they've got the great British Liberal Party. In the United States, it wasn't used at all until 1932. That was such a significant nerd find for me. So it's new. And I think one of the things that we'll get at the end here is, because it's new, it might alleviate us from being married to that term, because new terms come around all the time. So, well, I'll leave that for us at the end. Okay, from the moment that FDR claimed and redefined liberalism in that way, the word has been under constant attack. And that leads to my second major finding. So the first is liberalism is new. My second major finding: there were 3 overlapping attacks on the meaning of liberalism in the middle of the 20th century. And these lines of attacks have basically stuck until today. They're still the same attacks you hear today. And I invite you all and urge you all and beg you all to recall that whenever you hear somebody refer to somebody as a liberal, you think about what definition of liberal they're using. I'll explain that in a little bit. But first, the 3 lines of attack. So the first line of attack began in the 1950s. And it was from those on the right. They began attacking liberalism, imagining liberals as people who do little more than usher in communism. The patron saint of the modern right, a guy named William F. Buckley Jr., who I got to talk about the last time I was here in Kansas City Public Library, he titled his 1959 manifesto, "Up from Liberalism." This was, of course, a play on up from slavery, right? Some of you know this. So he's paralleling 20th century liberalism to chattel slavery, right? And Buckley spent the first 217 pages of the 229-page book attacking liberalism. I was dying to find, what is this conservatism that he's trying to bring to America? And I got 217 pages of attacks. And at the 12 final pages, when he goes on to try and define what conservative movement might look like, he gives up. I'm not joking, I mean, he does. And he said it's this hatred of liberalism that must be the glue that keeps together the conservative movement. Whittaker Chambers, Richard Nixon, Kevin Phillips, and on have all portrayed liberals as economic numbskulls wanting to give money and social benefits away to underachievers. This has been the cornerstone of the right-wing attack on liberals ever since, although there have been several additions and adaptations over time. But that's basically the gist of the right-wing attack. The second attack came simultaneously. It wasn't just the right, but this one came from the left. Beginning in the 1950s and 1960s, the American left, people like Saul Alinsky, Norman Mailer, Irving Howe, and more, they imagined liberals as the beards of global capitalism, foreclosing radical political visions in order to advocate some dreary picket fence version of American life. My friend who writes about Karl Marx in America, who's on the political left, this is how he understands liberals today. In a fantastic story, in the late 1960s, the radical Jerry Rubin, who many of you might know or have heard of, hardly somebody in the American political mainstream, he jumped on stage at the 1967 Human Be-In in San Francisco while the Grateful Dead were playing. And Jerry Garcia turned to Jerry Rubin and said, I want to do the voice so badly. He said, "Why enter this closed society and make an effort to liberalize it? Why not just leave your liberal visions and go someplace else?" Irving Howe, the great socialist founder of Dissent magazine, was more circumspect, saying when Congress outlawed the Communist Party, democracy has suffered a blow and liberalism has struck it. Perhaps more humorously, the great singer-songwriter and parodist Phil Oakes, People know where I'm going with this one probably. Yeah, we can sing it along later. He wrote an entire song attacking liberals called Love Me, I'm a Liberal from 1966. And it had fantastic verses like, I cheered when Humphrey was chosen, my faith in the system restored, because the Democrats didn't pick a more radical vision. I'm glad the commies were thrown out of the AFL-CIO board. I love Puerto Ricans and Negroes as long as they don't move next door. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. And it went on for 18 verses just making fun of liberals from the left. So now we've got two lines of attack, one from the right, one from the left. And the key thing there that I want to convey is that they have totally different visions of what a liberal is. One sees the liberals as the beards of capitalists, wanting white picket fence to rule America. And the other one says liberals bringing in the slippery slope of communism so that we're all going to be equal and move into apartments that are the exact same square footage. They're very different meanings of what a liberal is. Then there's a third line of attack on liberals, and that comes from civil rights advocates. Even from someone as immersed in the mid-century liberal tradition as Martin Luther King Jr., despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which all, we have to admit, were passed in part by self-proclaiming white liberals, civil rights advocates grew tired of what they saw as just the halfway commitments of white liberals. They were only willing to end legal segregation and not willing to make sacrifices on behalf of true equality. To quote Martin Luther King Jr., as long as the struggle was down in Alabama and Mississippi, King said, white liberals could look afar and think about it and say how terrible people are. But when they discovered that brotherhood had to be a reality in Chicago and that brotherhood extended next door, then those latent hostilities came out. People like Gwendolyn Brooks, Lorraine Hansberry, and James Baldwin all made similar critiques. Gwendolyn Brooks has a fantastic poem that I quote at length about the white women of the White Women Do-Gooder Society going to give money to the poor black communities, and they go and they've never seen this poverty, and they won't let their dresses touch the walls because it's so dirty, and they've never seen newspapers as carpet before, and they say, I wonder if we can send money via post next time. My kids went to and go to Gwendolyn Brooks Middle School, so more power to you, Gwendolyn Brooks. And these are from the mainstream civil rights advocates, so don't let me get started on people like Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X, who had much more frustrated and angry things to say about white liberals. So with attacks coming from multiple angles, by the 1970s, most Americans ran from what was one time the most popular political label in America. In the hands of enemies, the right, the left, civil rights advocates, and without defenders, liberals, the dreaded L word in Ronald Reagan's parlance, you might remember from 1988, can now be imagined as snooty, overeducated, sometimes professors, indifferent to the poor truly, except in word, and eventually today, woke snowflakes. Liberalism itself came to be seen as bureaucratic, ineffectual, and unmoored. Everybody hates the DMV, right? Except I love the DMV. I mean, I got a driver's license, we all do, but we're supposed to hate the DMV for its inefficiencies. And these various attacks led to my third finding. Today, there is no agreement about what a liberal is. And this was actually quite fascinating finding in my research. Because what I discovered is that what you think a liberal is actually tells me more about your politics than it tells me about what a liberal actually is, if we can find any of them. And it basically follows the three lines of attack that started in the 1950s and 1960s. For instance, if today you're sitting in this room and you think white liberals are quasi-communists, eager to indoctrinate your children in predatory sex schemes that may or may not start in the basement of pizza parlors, and they turn social services into mechanisms of perpetual dependency, well, then you're likely a conservative who respects Tucker Carlson and watches Fox News or OANN. But if you think white liberals are mostly the beards for the corporate order, too wimpy to advocate real change, NIMBYs, you guys know NIMBYs? right? Neighbors, right? Not in my backyard, exactly. Cloaked in progressive verbiage. My favorite are the lawn signs. In this house we believe, right? That's one, right? I walk the dog every day and I see the lawn signs. Then you're likely someone who thinks that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has some good ideas, and David Graeber is one of America's great thinkers. But if you think white liberals are fake friends who actually fail to show up when times are needy, who use nice words but don't recognize microaggressions or challenge structural racism in ways that are actually going to cost them, then you're likely sympathizer of minorities. You likely sympathize with minoritized communities and may even be a civil rights advocate yourself. You look up to people like Lorraine Hansberry, James Baldwin, or Ibram X. Kendi to bring us up to date. That these perceptions hardly have anything to do with liberals themselves is irrelevant. What is true is that how you define a white liberal says as much and maybe more about you than about them. It quickly became clear as I did my research that how one defines a white liberal is a Rorschach test of one's own political allegiances. So think about that next time you hurl that word as an epithet. What is it you're actually complaining about? Part of this, I think, has to do with what liberalism is at root. In other words, liberalism has some of the blame to bear for this. Premised from its central founding ideal of expanding individual freedoms, remember, liber is free, and then the word has morphed meanings as people have used it to try and free themselves from whatever that yoke is that seems to be controlling them. It became clear very quickly to me that given too much freedom, people will curtail other people's freedoms. So, for instance, in a real example, my freedom to swing my arms stops as soon as I make contact with your face. So liberalism has not been imagined as a new set of policies, because we can't have expansive freedoms, because eventually I'm going to punch you in the jaw. I'm not going to, but I'm saying that if I had true freedom, I would be able to. So liberalism has come to be understood as an ideal or a spirit, is the way that is really helpful for me to think of it. It was Eleanor Roosevelt, speaking on behalf of the Americans for Democratic Action, the ADA as it was known, in the mid-20th century. It was a political activism committee. And she said it best, perhaps, when she said, liberalism rests not on a set of dogmas or on a blueprint. So it's not any specific policies, but rather it's a spirit which each generation of liberals must learn to apply to the needs of its own time. She added that spirit is unchanging, a deep belief in the dignity of man and an awareness of human frailty, a faith in human reason and the power for free inquiry, a high sense of individual responsibility for oneself and for one's neighbor, a conviction that the best society is a brotherhood that enables the great numbers of its members to develop their own potentialities to the utmost. Okay. So liberalism is best understood as a spirit and not a list of policies. And that explains how it has shifted definitions over the course of the 20th century. FDR's understanding of the New Deal was called what I've come to label quantitative liberalism, which has to do with numbers. It was about raising Americans out of poverty in the depth of the Great Depression, when there was a 25% unemployment rate and up to 50% unemployment rate in manufacturing cities like Detroit and close to that in places like Kansas City. It's shifted over the 20th century because things like the New Deal worked, and World War II, putting Americans back to work. So by the 1950s, FDR's liberalism had been achieved, and liberalism transitioned from something called quantitative liberalism to qualitative liberalism, where liberalism came to mean enhancing the quality of life for many Americans, granting access to higher education, opening Americans up to the arts, improving housing, giving people access to travel. There was, of course, a Cold War component to this, and a fairly aggressive foreign policy, by which you should be thinking the Vietnam War. And this has led to critiques of post-war liberals as warmongering and more. And this all came to a head during the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson. and his Great Society in the 1960s. Great Society is his phrase for it. And that was about expanding quantitative and qualitative liberalism into areas it had not reached before. Most especially in LBJ's heart was in poor Americans, impoverished Americans, but also in part because of pressure from civil rights advocates, also to black Americans, and women's rights advocates to women as well. It was an expansive kind of liberalism. But this invited critiques that liberalism was overly bureaucratic. It was too friendly to minorities. It came at a cost to what we now know of as the white working class. And you first start hearing that language, the white working class, enter into American politics in 1967, 1968. And in 1969, every major magazine says, "What's up with the white working class?" Liberals and liberalism seem to be on retreat, starting in the late 1960s. And I found this shocking. In 1968, not a single Democratic presidential candidate, and there were 4 of them, claimed to be a liberal, even though several of them had given speeches as soon as 2 or 3 years before 1968. One of them even wrote a book that was called A Liberal Answer to the Rise of Conservatism that came out in 1965. In 1968, no one claimed to be a liberal. It was on the run. And it has been ever since. There have been attempts to resuscitate the term. Daniel Patrick Moynihan called his version intelligent liberalism. I don't know what dumb liberalism was, but his was intelligent liberalism. There was a group of Democratic politicians who wanted to expand Silicon Valley, and they called themselves neoliberals, neo-liberals. That didn't necessarily mean what we think of neoliberalism today, but it has a similar origin story that I can nerd out on with you if you want in the Q&A. But the story, to say the least, has been one of dramatic retreat. As such, liberals have come to mean whatever people you want it to mean, and most especially your enemies. And in the hands of enemies like Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulter, liberals have come to be elitists who claim to know better than everyone else. One of the issues that given them lots of fodder is so-called political correctness, where liberal elites police what you're allowed to say, and do so in the name of freedom. Universities were rife for attack. This was one of the reasons libtards was such a potent phrase, because it was connecting liberal with a word that had been policed out of usage, putting those things together, putting thumbs in your eye. And if you want to know why liberals have been rife for attack in the recent administration, this is one reason why. So was the media. Movies were deemed arenas where liberal elite told stories of coastal elites telling common folks what they should think about major issues in American life, like racial integration and abortion. One point that I found super fascinating as I was doing my research is the critique of liberalism moved into a cultural and social realm. It's academics, it's Hollywood, it's television that is the liberal elite telling people what to do, as opposed to economics and politics. And this is super important because that means you can attack liberals no matter what party is in power or who's getting rich off the current government. So the critique moved from the political to the social and the cultural. And fourth, this leads to my final conclusion. It is time, sadly, maybe for some of you, to give up the word liberal and stop trying to defend it. As I mentioned, absent any defenders, from the late 1960s on, the image of the liberal has molded to mean whatever its enemies want it to mean. It's an amoebic specter haunting anyone eager to push for social change. It's useful now only to its enemies. Interestingly, it's become clear that many of the policies central to what was recognized as liberalism are still really popular. Few want to upend Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, FEMA. We're watching this happen in live time, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. No one is really eager to overturn these things or is afraid, they are afraid to pay the political cost to overturn that, the things that Jimmy Smits was talking about in the West Wing. So instead of attacking liberal ideas, mostly they're attacking now liberals. Liberals are weak, they're elitists, they're snobbish, they're wealthy, they're out of touch. These were personal attributes worth hating, not political stances. And this is carried forward from the birth of someone called the limousine liberal, which was actually a democratic phrase. It started in New York. So now liberal no longer carries the meaning that it once had. I was struck recently when I was looking at some polling data. And liberal now no longer means centrist in any way, but it means to the left of anything else most of the time. I was looking at a poll recently and it was asking Americans what their how they described their own political belief. Some said conservative, some said liberal, and in the middle, now there was this new category called moderate. So whereas the center of American politics used to be liberal, now liberal has been pushed to the left spectrum, and moderate occupies that center phrase. I've been watching for years, and maybe you have too, lots of Democratic politicians try and resuscitate some word that might signify what it is that they are trying to do. Barack Obama tried to convince business leaders to contribute more to the commonweal by reminding them, you might remember this speech, that they didn't build that, right? The infrastructure that powered the success of the businessmen in America, business people in America. But he never gave his vision of balancing individual achievement with social consciousness a name. You can't call it liberal anymore. What are you going to call it? Joe Biden Jr.'s signature pieces of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Bill, they did actually many things beyond what their title suggested that they did. They did. But he did never come up with a name after Bidenomics. Never stuck. He complained about his lack of marketing only after it was too late for him to run for office anymore. And for her part, Kamala Harris made a powerful reference to an individual's need for society to succeed, but the only label she gave us had to do with coconuts and coconut trees. And so the Democrats today have no banner under which they can march. Something particularly important as we come to realize that political affiliation is often little more than an affirmation of collective identity. So what can replace liberalism as the Democratic Party's rallying cry, if anything? If liberalism has been sullied by 50 years of attacks, what should replace it? I had an article published recently in Yahoo! News, and it was about what phrases were floating out there that the Democratic Party might be able to hang their hats on. And when I saw the title, which I didn't give it, hang their hats on, I thought, what are they talking about? And the picture right next to it was of a red MAGA hat. And I was like, oh, I see what they're going for. Good job, editor. I think right now, and what we might expect to see, and I could be wrong, is one phrase that will make a run for it, we'll see, social democracy. I'm starting to see it a lot in the left-wing Twitter sphere, if you follow that kind of stuff. It balances the individualism of democracy with the social commitments that are historically aligned with what used to be called liberalism. The most popular politician in America right now, does anybody know who that is? Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, and again, this is polling data, so don't argue with me, but this is actually a fact, is the most popular politician in America. He sometimes uses the label social democracy for what it is that he's pushing. Two of America's premier intellectuals, E.J. Dionne and James Kloppenberg, are co-authoring this long history trying to resuscitate the word social democracy. Interestingly, I was emailing with them, and E.J. Dionne seems to have withdrawn his support maybe for that word, while James Kloppenberg is actively supporting it, so we'll see what happens. But whatever emerges to replace liberalism, it's helpful to remember that before 1932, hardly anyone in the United States ever used the word liberal to describe any kind of politics. Over the past 100 years, it had a good run. Now, rest in peace. And I would say, without coming up with anything new, we will be living with another neologism that is less than 10 years old, and that word is MAGA. Thank you. So yes, questions, fair game, please.
If you have a question, please go to the microphone so the folks watching at home can hear you as well as the answer.
So I'm old enough to remember when Howard Dean said, "I'm from the liberal wing of the Democratic Party," and that was a huge applause line for him.
Yeah.
And that was when I think liberal was very out of fashion. So it does keep arising. And I feel like there's a couple things. I think they hate us because they want to be us. You know, the liberals have always sort of defined what America was aspiring to. Mm-hmm. And I think that that conservatives, you started by saying that the only thing that defines them is their hatred of liberals, whereas the liberal encompasses a lot of, sort of American ideas and a lot of American value systems and so on. Mm-hmm. So, I guess I haven't given up on the word liberal, and I don't know that we need a label that can be our banner, because it's hard to put everybody under a single banner. But I think there's many people working towards a similar vision of, social supports and inclusivity and so on.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I mean, if you look at the most recent election returns, basically 1/3 of voting age Americans didn't vote. 1/3 voted for Donald Trump, plus 10,000 votes in a few states, and 1/3 voted for Kamala Harris, who embraced that kind of idea. There is power to a banner. There is a reason that you sing along to certain songs. And I think that it's interesting that the word liberal is not that old. So it doesn't mean that earlier in the progressive era, in the 1910s and 20s, when you have these big movements against the oligarchic powers of J.P. Morgan and people like that, there was a different banner to march under. That was progressive. That died out, and liberal came to replace it for a variety of historical reasons. One of the things that I noticed when I was doing my research is that at its peak in the 1940s and 1950s, 47% of Americans claimed to be a liberal, and another 25% of Americans claimed to have positive feelings towards liberals, even if they didn't take that claim. The book was actually just today excerpted in Harper's Magazine, which is like an author's dream to have your book excerpted in Harper's Magazine. And the fact checker for Harper said, I said almost half. And he said 47% is not almost half. So I said, all right, okay, well, it's 48, 49, where are we here? It had a fun back and forth. Starting in that moment in the late 1960s, the number of Americans who claimed to be liberal went downhill. And it was, it's out about 20% now. There were a few moments, Howard Dean, when it bumped up. Actually, you are exactly right. And in 2016, when Donald Trump was first elected president, it bumped up again in favorability rankings. But then it went back down. And after it bumps up, what we see are books coming out by the people that you're talking about, by Adam Gopnik in The New Yorker, who are trying to resuscitate the word liberal. And all of these books fall flat. And a fun experience I had was reading reviews of these books, because the title of the reviews, one title for Adam Gopnik's book, and I'm paraphrasing here, was 60-year-old boomer tries to write book to left-wing kid who doesn't understand what he's talking about. And that was the defense of liberalism. Remember back when it meant something? Now it doesn't mean what they think it meant. So I think the core group of ideas, this is actually central, is to dissociate the ideas of liberalism from the word liberal. I think those core ideas still do have meaning to lots and lots of Americans, but I worry that the word is now more problematic than it's worth. Great question, though. Yeah.
Yeah, you referenced Josh Hawley and Bernie Sanders. Mm-hmm. It's going to shock a lot of people in the audience. They have introduced a bill jointly to keep credit card things at 10%. And Josh Hawley said he admired Bernie Sanders. And I've heard people who are right-wing come across as just total rednecks, but they like Bernie Sanders. And I asked one of them one time, why do you like Bernie Sanders? He said he sounds like where he comes from, which is originally from New York City, and he sounds like that. And they had the old labor leaders who sounded like they had a working class accent and represented working class people who weren't exactly liberal, but they voted Democrat and liberal time after time. And so my question is, perhaps if we had more spokesmen who sounded perhaps the way they come from, I'm talking about dialect and a way of expressing themselves, because most liberals say Missouri as opposed to Missouri, and that may seem like a little thing, but I maintain we might want to recruit us. I consider myself pretty much a Democrat, whatever, to recruit Democrats that say Missouri, and that may sound like that's silly and everything like that, but you would reach working class people better if the leaders sounded a little bit more like they do, because nowadays they don't. And so what's your thoughts on that?
So that's a great question. Here in Missouri, I get the best questions. Did I say it right? Okay, one of the most fascinating things that I encountered was exactly on this point. So in 1968, what we now call the white working class, they were for Robert Kennedy, because Robert Kennedy was a Democrat who was speaking to working class needs. He came from Boston and sounded like a Bostonian. He gets assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan in a hotel in Los Angeles while he's running for president. All of a sudden, the white working class doesn't have anybody to vote for. So who do they vote for in 1968? George Wallace, which is the opposite end of the political spectrum, right? Okay, fast forward to today. Joe Rogan, do you all know who Joe Rogan is? He's the most popular podcaster in America. In 2020, he supported Bernie Sanders for president. The right-wing bro culture that all you read about, right? Joe Rogan was supporting Bernie Sanders because there was a level of authenticity and speaking to the basic needs of the people, right? And in 2024, he shifted course, and it was to Donald Trump. So there is something about two things that you bring up that's exactly right. One is charisma. The power of politicians' charisma is key, absolutely. And the other thing is being able to speak in a non-elitist kind of way so that people can understand you, that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're super partisan. So those two things really struck me as this sort of big middle that this woman was talking about with the first question that exists out there, ready to be grabbed by some authentic, charismatic, but also authentic politician. I think it's there. So yeah, great question. Yeah.
Has there been a single Republican presidential nominee since Thomas Dewey in 1944 who has not been labeled a Nazi, an anti-Semite, and a racist by liberals?
So I love this because what is a liberal to you? Like the liberals, like is Ted Kennedy calling Ronald Reagan a Nazi? I don't think so.
Harry Truman called Tom Dewey a Nazi. Reagan, Nixon, the Bushes, Trump, virtually McCain, Romney have all been called racist, have been called Nazis. Gerald Ford, who was an inherently decent man, whose last public act was fighting to preserve affirmative action at the University of Michigan, was described as a racist by the Carter campaign. That's not helpful to democracy, to label anybody indiscriminately as a racist or a Nazi. And that's happened to every Republican candidate since Thomas Dewey in 1944. 1944, the labor union said Dewey was like Hitler because he had a mustache. So second question.
Yeah.
How many Republican presidents since Dwight Eisenhower have been accepted by liberals as legitimately and fairly elected?
All of them, I would think. I mean, yeah, I think all of them.
The October surprise with Reagan, Iran-Contra with Bush.
I mean, these don't
Agnew and Anna Chennault with Nixon. Watergate with Nixon. Every single Republican candidate has had the legitimacy of their election questioned by the Democratic Party. Romney was not elected, but when Bush was reelected, it was because of stolen votes in Ohio. John Kerry said that we need to investigate, that the election was rigged, that the voting machines were tampered with.
I hear
Every
you.
single Republican who's been elected since Dwight Eisenhower has been said to be elected fraudulently and illegally by the Democratic Party. So who's the enemy of democracy? Which party?
Sir, sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt.
Let's give him a chance to answer the question, and then we have four more we need to get to, and not a whole lot of time.
We got the question. So who's the enemy of democracy? I would say that politics is hard-nosed business. I think that's true. I think both parties fling mud, absolutely. I think that when you start thinking and claiming that parties as a whole claim that elections were illegitimate, you're stepping out of line, because I don't know that in and as proof of that, to give one, and I could give many examples, in 1984, when the Republican Party drubbed the Democrats 49 states to 1, the Democrats did not say that this was an illegal election. The Democrats crawled back and started talking. Watergate was a legitimate criminal investigation that led to Nixon resigning. So I don't know what that has to do with the Democratic
He
Party.
legitimized his victory in '72.
I would like to get to some of these other questions if we can before it gets too late.
Which he also won 49-1. So yeah, let's talk afterwards, because I like this line of thought. So we can talk afterwards, okay? Yeah, next question.
Sir, you should write a book, and we'll invite you to the library, and we'll come ask you questions. So
Yeah.
thank you. I appreciate. I want to hear more of what you have to say.
Yeah.
So my question, as someone who is very online, someone who worked at a progressive organization that paid $500,000 to come up with progressive values and then laid off half their staff without really much of a thought, someone who spends time on Instagram and actually sees people that are my liberal friends talking about causes that I agree with, that I find myself turning against because of how they're lecturing me and talking to me online. And I'm glad you referenced those signs that are outside of people's houses. We have a neighborhood here in Prairie Village that's very affluent that has signs like, Prairie Village is for everyone, but you can't see the part that says if you can afford it.
Right. If you make $500,000 a year,
yes.
right?
So I think the question is, how can liberals actively be less detestable? Because as someone who is a liberal, I watch the way they interact with the world, and it feels like they're like, we're going to be your best friend until you start asking me questions or questioning me. So what steps can we take?
It's a great question. Again, I have trouble with the phraseology of liberals because my brain is stuck with these different categories. But how can, say, the Democratic Party, which has come to embody liberalism in the United States at this point in time, be less detestable? I think they do have clearly an elitism problem. And I think that it's not an accident that the Democratic Party consists of more college graduates than the other parties do, the Republican Party. And I think that there is a sensibility of we know better, so we're going to do this better. And I absolutely think that this gets to this gentleman's point right here, where all of a sudden it becomes exactly what you're saying online, lecturing and didactic, and I know more about you, so I'm going to do these kinds of things for you, even if you don't ask for them or don't want them. I think that critique has been amplified in the social media sphere, and especially by the right wing, to become sort of second nature and assumed to be such. To get to your question then, how does the Democratic Party come back? How do liberals reclaim that mantle that FDR had, where people would put his picture up in their kitchen and up over their fireplace? I mean, we sort of have seen this now with Bernie Sanders, the most popular politician in the United States, going around talking to people with his accent, but talking about kitchen table issues. And more than just talking about kitchen table issues, but also sort of listening to a broad spectrum of opinions. I started writing a piece that I don't know if it'll go anywhere, and I said, I knew Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist, was in trouble when he called himself a Waymo Democrat. So Waymo are the driverless cars, so he wants to be a technology Democrat. And I was like, in the 80s, we had Atari Democrats, right? And it didn't work. Right? 1984 election was 49 states to 1. And there's a playing to a certain kind of way of thinking. If we're just going to focus on the people who are making self-making cars, we need to focus on people here in Missouri who don't do that. Right? It has to become a way that is not, we're going to focus on just the upper echelons of the economic sphere, but actually focus on ways that affect the future. One thing that I'm absolutely seeing right now is what happened to manufacturing in the United States in the 1970s and 1980s, which was the decimation of the manufacturing plants around here, right? What's happening now to the intellectual classes is AI. AI is going to wipe out the bottom rungs, just like the manufacturing technologies and exportation of jobs. So we're going to see that happen now. And that'll be really interesting to see how people respond to that. Because the Waymo Democrats is not going to be the way that you're going to capture 50% of plus one Americans in order to actually enact change. It's a great question, though.
Love it, thank you.
Yeah.
Kevin, we'll go over here, and then we'll finish up with 2 questions from people watching on YouTube.
Sure. I'm happy to stay. Yeah.
What do you have to say with that liberals and conservatives both lost because Trump has taken over the Republican Party? It's not really liberals and conservatives anymore. When you talk about the common man and you think about all the, all the businesses that shipped jobs overseas, and Clinton was NAFTA, both parties really have failed. And we talk about the liberals failing, but the conservatives have obviously failed. And so we shouldn't feel as if we're the only ones who didn't catch the trend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have all these articles that I want to write. We'll see if any of them ever get done. But this article started out, and it gets to this point exactly, which is, so I also write a textbook. So if you're a college student now, you might be forced to buy my textbook and read my textbook. And in textbooks, we have the Revolutionary era, we have the Civil War era, we have Reconstruction period, right? So when does our era start? What are the first years of our time? And when I was revising the textbook, what I realized was that 2008 is the first years of our time. We had the financial crash, right? And if you study young people back here and in the audience, you guys got hosed by the financial crash because it delayed your ability to get jobs and build wealth by a significant amount of years. When older people, I just missed it, when older people were able to start building our wealth and getting our jobs sooner, and that, we all know how compound interest works, right? So I think that 2008, with this financial crash, the insecurity, what comes out of 2008? The Tea Party movement, Occupy Wall Street. Shortly thereafter, the Black Lives Matter campaign, right? And then at the same time, getting to the guy before you's question, the App Store came out, which I signify to mean everything moved online. I think Trump and his movement, coming out of the Tea Party movement, were the first to recognize that this is a new era with a new kind of politics. What did Barack Obama do? He bailed out the banks, right? He didn't help the people who were late in getting life started. So I think as long as there is that connection to this older idea of what is going to make our politics work, I think both parties, the Democratic Party still is mired in this, and it needs to update its chronology to say this is the first year in our time, and this is how the politics need to look. And if I go back to an earlier era, my politics are going to be out of step. So I think your point is exactly right, and I think the remaking of the Republican Party by Donald Trump, who is, it has to be said, the most successful, most brilliant politician of his generation. I mean, he destroyed the Clinton and the Bush political dynasties in one single election within 6 months of each other. That's a remarkable fact, right? So he's tapping into something, and I think he was the first and the most powerful to do it. And I think Bernie Sanders is as well. And it's not just his accent. But I do think that helps. Yeah.
All right, we'll finish up with these 2 from people watching at home. First up, did the failure of the American liberal movement to achieve any real liberal gains somehow result in the fracturing of the liberal community in America?
Okay, a complicated question because I want to say there were real liberal gains.
But for example, the New Deal never became exactly what FDR intended it to be. It never went as far as what he'd hoped it would.
Okay, fair enough. So liberalism and liberals in the mid-20th century pushed for significant amounts of change and then would compromise those things. Fair enough. I do think it's not fair to discount the New Deal and Social Security programs. I don't think it's fair to discount the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act. These things were not perfect. And the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which created public housing, might have actually done more damage than good. We can have that debate, right? But it didn't come out of bad intentions, right? Fighting for women's economic rights in the 1970s was another accomplishment. So I do think there were significant accomplishments that we need to give liberals credit for if you think those things were good things. I do think there is this sense where people expect you to keep pushing and keep fighting and compromise less. And when you do make those compromises, it looks like you're sacrificing your ideals. And I think that's a constant refrain on the right and on the left. We're seeing it right now with the budget reconciliation bill with the Republicans, where some of the diehard Republicans are saying this bill doesn't go far enough and I'm not going to vote for it, so you're compromising on our values. I think liberalism fell because it was in power, and that meant it had to compromise to keep broadening its tent. And secondly, I think because it was in power, people chipped away at it. William F. Buckley chipped away at it. Saul Alinsky chipped away at it from the left in order to create space for their own movements. And I think they were incredibly successful at doing that, both rhetorically by making liberals seem weak, out of touch, ineffectual, overly bureaucratic, but then also because the louder their microphones got, the more their voices got amplified, and then they got more and more of a following. So yeah, good question.
That is a nice transition to our final question. How do you define liberalism in a world where somebody like Josh Hawley is threatening to vote against a budget bill over cuts to Medicaid?
To quote Eleanor Roosevelt, look, I think if we're going to be historically honest, the best way to understand what liberalism is to see it as a spirit that tries in various circumstances to push forward individual freedoms in the context in which we're living. So if somebody is trying to snuff out your freedom, you can claim the liberal tradition to push back against that. Now, if that is the Catholic Church, for instance, that is trying to snuff out your freedom, I'm going back 200 years here, you can push back against the power of the church and say, we should have things like Article 6 of the Constitution, which says there shall be no religious tests in who gets elected. We shall have things like the First Amendment of the United States, which says we have the freedom of worship, and there shall be no establishment of religion in our country. So that is a way to understand liberalism. And it's constantly shifting depending on who it is that is perceived to be denying your freedoms. And I think that flexibility is its unbelievable strength in that it's been adaptable, and also a weakness because it's opened it up to critiques that it is not with deep foundations. And people like solid ground to stand on, whether that's religious faith, whether that's diehard nationalism, whether that's some sense of truth with a capital T. And liberalism says, I'm for your freedom, let's figure out a way to go for it. That's been the historic meaning of that word, and it's shifted over time in the United States. That's what my book is about. So now to define it in a specific policy way, I think would actually be to do disservice to what that word has done over the last 100 years.
Kevin, thank you very much. This is fantastic. Come back anytime.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.